All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming along. So hopefully you've been staring at the flickering TVs on the side, but if you haven't, then deltaDNA is an analytics and CRM company, and what I'm going to talk about today is some trends that I've seen in the data about how this kind of business of games has been evolving over the last 2 years. And the reason I was motivated to do that is whenever I sort of talk to clients and I think about games, if this works at all, it's still clear that making games is really hard, right? It's hard to have a profitable games business at any point, actually, where it's 2019 or 1975. So, particularly there is this constant frustration that the biggest games have been entrenched at the top of the charts for just absolutely years, right? If you look, it doesn't matter when you look and what charts you look at. 7 of the top 10 grossing games have been there for more than 2 years. So you're sitting there making a game and you're thinking, how am I going to compete with these guys with 200 million MAU plus and studios all over the world and billions of dollars, right? And it gets even harder because you can't just make a game. I mean, there are lots of indies out there, but making a game and getting it in the store and getting the marketing up and running, getting the live ops and running is really expensive. And you have to be confident that your game's gonna be a hit. You have to be sure that you're gonna get that money back. Otherwise, you only really get one shot at it. And the real challenge is that most of the money in games today is in UA. So unfortunately, Eric would have been telling you all about how UA has been trending over the last few years, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it, but the reality, no matter what, is it costs you a lot of money to get users in your games. It's very hard to grow organically to the scales that you need to be to challenge the charts. So CPIs are high. We're looking at the games on our platform, less than 30% of them are ROAS positive, and it can take ages. Even if you have the best users, it might take 6+ the money back that you spent on that install because they're doing small IAPs or they're watching ads that are worth a couple of cents each. Got to fix the stage. That's part of the job. Right, so is there any good news? And so I tried to find some good news in the games that we have on our platform. So we have had thousands of games on our platform for a few years now. And what I really wanted to know is, has it been getting easier? Has it been getting easier? Not for the big guys. Everyone knows that Supercell's still doing great and Rovio is still doing great. But what about the other guys? What about the people that are making smaller games, maybe games that have 1 million MAU, right? Is it getting easier for those folk? And so what I did is I looked at all the kind of yearly revenues for the games we have on the platform in terms of IAPs, and I looked at the rankings on the App Store. So this is just the US App Store. I tried to keep it nice and clean. All the other app stores have been growing in different ways. So I just looked at the US App Store and I tried to line up what it would take in terms of yearly revenue to achieve a kind of typical ranking, gross ranking in the store. So as you can imagine, the top 10 has been pretty static, right? Top 10, the game that's exactly ranked 10 would make couple of $100 million in the US alone in 2016, and it's a little bit more in 2018, but not a huge amount, right? So the top games have been making about the same amount of money for the last couple of years. But what's interesting is, and on the chart I'm talking about is on the right here with the kind of purple and the blue line. So what's interesting is if you take, say, the 100th ranking game in the store. So in 2016, that would have made, a couple of $1 million a year. Whereas in 2018, it's making more like $5-6 million a year. So actually, the more kind of rank 100, rank 500 games have shown a lot of growth, right? And what's really interesting is if you actually look at these curves and you sort of add it up, you can start to see that, in 2016, 80% or 85% of all the revenue in games was in the top 100 games. So if you weren't in the top 100 games, you weren't really getting a really big slice of the pie. In 2018, actually, it's only 61%. So there's a much bigger chunk of revenue that's in these kind of mid-tier games between, say, rank 100 and rank 1,000, or maybe even beyond that, right? So actually, when you look at, say, the overall revenue growth, so the numbers in here are based on these stats, but you can look around in Yuzu and SuperData and these kind of folk, you get the same kind of growth, right? In the US App Store, in 2016, based on this, it was maybe like an $8 billion pie for everyone to get into, right? That's grown to $11 billion in 2018. But 31% of that growth has been outside the top 100. So actually, when we talk about the bubble of mobile games are getting more revenue, more everything every year, it's not the kind of biggest top 10 games that are driving that. It's actually the mid-tier guys. It's the guys rank 100, rank 200, rank 300 that are making better games, making more engaging games, and getting more revenue as a result of that. So this is my kind of good news. Is actually, it's not as bad as it used to be where if I'm not in the top 20, I'm going to go broke, right? Actually, you can really make a sustainable game that is in this kind of mid-tier. So why is it getting easier? If you believe the numbers I've shown, then what's changed, right? So if you look, again, just in the US, the number of players hasn't really changed. 2 years ago, there was maybe 180 million players in the US. It's about the same now, maybe a little bit more, depending on where you get your numbers from. When we look at, say, ARPDAUs in deltaDNA, they haven't changed that much. They're up a little bit, but the actual ARPDAUs, the amount of revenue you make per player per day, hasn't really changed very much. But what has changed is the value of each player coming in the door. So conversion rates over a lifetime are up, the number of transactions per spender is up, the average lifespan, and this is where it becomes really interesting, average lifespan of a player has gone from being 8 days to being 12 days. So every install is more valuable. So even though ARPDAUs are the same, the base of your game is higher, right? You pay for a million installs, those installs stay longer. They only spend the same amount every day, but they're playing for longer, so you don't have to keep buying more and more UA to backfill these users that you're losing. The other interesting thing, I'm not going to go too much into this, but there'll be plenty of other talks that you can see around the show about this, that the business model has very much changed. So when you look at 2016, 10 of the top 100 games were paid apps. In fact, there's only one in the top 100 that I could find recently, which is Minecraft, obviously. Also, we've seen a lot of growth. So we've been running ad surveys for a number of years now, and when we match that up with what we see in our platform, we can see that the revenue from ads has really grown. So the average game 2 years ago was making maybe 25% of the revenue from ads. I know that average doesn't make a lot of sense because there's games that only do ads and there's games that only do IAPs, but average game has been making 25%, whereas it's gone up to 32%. But really what's really interesting is the number of games that are totally ad supported, like the growth of hyper-casual, but even other types of games where they've gone, no, IAP, an IAP economy is difficult, let's just go fully ad-supported. That's really grown, and we've seen a kind of doubling of that. So in 2016, only 8% of games were totally ad-supported. Now it's more like 17%. So there are, as well as IAP revenue going up for these mid-tier games, actually there's been access to other business models that make it easier as well. But I'm not going to talk too much about that anymore. What I think is really interesting is when we look at how people have been managing their UA, the games we have on our platform, it's fundamentally changed. So in 2016, and this is kind of a classic mobile growth story, in 2016, and if you look at the chart on the right, 2016 is the dashed lines, the split between organic and paid. What you'd see is that there'd be a really big boost at launch, right? You'd do your best to get featured, you get as much organic traffic as possible, you'd pile in with the paid UA at the same time, so you have a big game, and then it would tail off. So every game would have this huge peak at the beginning, and then after a couple of months, basically, you'd reach this either flat line or very low level of new installs. And the game, the lifespan of the game would be 6 months maybe. What we're seeing in 2018 is a much more modest approach. So there's still a big organic peak at the beginning. You try to get featured, you try to get as much enthusiasm as possible, but actually, people aren't really kicking in with their paid UA until a little bit later, once they learn a little bit more about what their players like, where the best sources of traffic are, how they can actually get the best return from their spends rather than just trying to get as many people in the door as possible. And what you're seeing is a much more sustainable growth of games, right? Games are designed to last longer. In 2018, the clear approach is that you try to build a sustainable game and add in all the live ops and add in all the features that you can actually get the value back from your very expensive UA campaigns. And so you're seeing that people are taking a more scientific approach to it rather than just going this boom bust. So how are people doing this? Well, actually, what I'm going to argue is people are doing this because they have access to better data. In 2016, as much as those platforms like us around, it was still not all decisions were data-driven. It wasn't obvious that you had to have a very clear path from your attribution through to your CPI, through to your IAP and ad LTV, so that you could actually really understand very quickly what users were. There was still the mindset that, look, we need to have a hit, let's go and get as many users as possible, and then it'll take off, right? So what we're definitely seeing these days is that people are much more scientific about their users. They want to understand these kind of 4 points. Where did my users come from? What did they see to get here? How much did it actually cost to get them into my game? And then once they get into the game, did the game meet their expectations? Is the marketing that I'm putting out there actually lining up with the experience that I'm offering? And then obviously, what is the value of these users? Either straight away, are they engaging with the economy that I've built, whether it's ads or IPs? And then, clearly, what's their estimated lifetime value so I know that I can invest more and I can run a sustainable business. So I'm going to kind of go and run through how I see these kind of questions manifesting themselves in the kind of data that we have in our platform. So first of all, this is really basic stuff here where it's pretty standard now that people will run quite a lot of different UA campaigns, and they'll want to know very basic stuff like, I ran a campaign on some different dates, where did it come from, how many installs, what was the CPI. And what's interesting is we definitely see in our data that people are running more and more smaller campaigns. In 2016, a typical game would run maybe 3 campaigns at a time. Now we're seeing people running 10 UA campaigns at a time. They've got all sorts of different content, playable and rewarded ads. They'll have a whole spread of different creatives to target different competitor games in different ways. And of course, cross-promotion is a really big deal now. And talking about cross-promotion a little bit, again, we've seen the average portfolio grow. So in 2016, a typical account on our platform would have 3 games. Now it has 6 games or more. For more casual genres, it might be 10 or 12 games. And so people are very much thinking about how do I manage a player across a portfolio of games, not necessarily just one game. And so when you're buying users, you're thinking about keeping them in your ecosystem, because even if they don't like the first game, I can use cross-promotion to keep them in my world as opposed to having to reacquire them. And so on the right here is just a kind of very basic cross-promotion strategy you might do if you find that someone's come into a game and they don't like it and they're churning and you want to move them to another game. Obviously, when people come straight into the game, what you want to see is how they respond to the game. One of the really interesting things about game design analytics is it's important to understand where the users come from. Organics and paid traffic will behave differently depending on what they've seen. Obviously, your organic traffic will usually be a pretty good benchmark because they're the ones that have found the game sort of in a natural way. Typically, these funnels are meant to be representative of, say, like the first 2 minutes of gameplay, right? So on deltaDNA, we see 78% of organics across most games will make it through the first 2 minutes, whatever that is for your game, whether it's a guided on tutorial or it's written tales. Usually within the first 2 minutes, people will have a pretty good read of whether they like something or not. Usually paid is better, although in some cases, obviously, if you're doing a bit of a scattergun UA approach, it won't be. But what can be interesting is when you start to look at the flow of your different cohorts through your game, right? Organics are a good read to how people that actually inclined to install it would go. But perhaps if you're running playable ads, you might get a better flow through because they have a better feel for what the game is like. They understand what the gameplay actually is, and they've got a warm start to it. If you're running just rewarded video, it might be worse because maybe the video that you showed them doesn't have any gameplay in it. Maybe it's kind of showing them an experience which is a bit different from the gameplay that they're actually going to have. And so typically you'd see people dropping off during the guided onboarding or even maybe a little bit earlier when they realize, actually, this is not the thing that I wanted, and they just drop the game. And of course, this is now money you've spent that is not being acted upon, right? It's actually wasted money. And the only way you're going to see that is be able to cohort your players in this way and actually look at how they're flowing through your game. And this can be quite good for optimizing the kind of marketing content you're putting out there to bring people to your game. You also want to know what the value of your players is straight away. So again, you might have some basic tables like this which show you stats like how many people are engaging in rewarded ads, if that's an important part of your economy. Typically, with the games on our platform, we see that maybe only 30 to 50% of all players will ever watch rewarded ads because they just don't like them or they're not embedded in the game in a way that makes them compelling. The number of ads you can show per session is an important metric to kind of get a feel for how much value you're actually going to generate from your ad strategy. And then, of course, the IAP conversion is kind of standard thing. But understanding this kind of immediate value is great, but actually what you really need is to be able to estimate what the LTV of your players is. And there's a whole different way, world of doing this out there. The important thing here, of course, is that if it's going to take you a long time to recover your CPI. If you're paying like $2, $3, maybe even more for your users, it's going to take you a long time over the whole cohort of players to get that back. And so, we see maybe at best take 2 weeks, more like 50 days to recover your CPI. And actually what's interesting is the best games start off more slowly. So what I've got on the right here is kind of a breakdown of all the games on our platform in terms of their LTV versus CPI, so the ROAS or ROAS. And so you see like the kind of 50th, the median game is breaking even after kind of 50 days or so, but it's very flat. So the LTV going up quite quickly and then plateauing. So they're getting all the value really, really quickly, but there's no long tail of value. The best games actually kind of continue to grow, and you see in the 90th percentile, it's going up and up and up and up. And actually, it starts off much more slowly. It's not front-loading a lot of the spend. It's actually taking quite a long time for it to get up to the full value of the player. Now, what's important, of course, is that you want to be able to measure or estimate these curves really quickly, right? You've spent a bunch of money on marketing. You know it's going to take you ages to get that money back. You want to spend more. You've got to be confident, right? Typically, what people do, this is just a kind of very quick summary of how this works, right, is they'll take maybe a week of gameplay from these people you've got to install, and then you'll do a simple model, which is just the lifetimes times the ARPDAU, right? So you get the retention curve. I'm sure a lot of people have done this before. You get the retention curve, and you multiply it through by the ARPDAU, and then you'll get the estimate of the lifetime value at whatever point you want, whether it's 180 days, 360 days. Now, what's interesting also is with our data, we can actually see if this works, right? So what I did is I took, I don't know how many games are in there, a couple hundred games, and I looked at how well this model works if you just apply it in the most simple way. And what's interesting is actually pretty good. So you can see here's a scatter plot of actual LTV versus predicted LTV. And most of the games actually are within kind of 20% of the real value. So even if you're not, I think the point of this is even if you don't have a team of data scientists and you don't have access to the best models, actually the simplest LTV model works pretty well if all you really want to know is, can I keep investing in these players after a week? Can I buy more players from this source? Of course, what you really want is a better model, and the kind of models that we've done with other clients. Using more data, you can easily get to 90% plus. But if you just need something rough and ready to actually convince yourself and probably your investors or your board that you can invest more, these things are perfectly valid. So, just sort of taking all that and looking forward, I mean, I think it's really interesting, a lot of this talk has been about the last 2 years, so what's going to be the next 2 years? And I think, probably Plans and Candy Crush will still be in the top 10 in 2 years. It's hard for a game with 200 million users, or monthly users, to lose them all, right? But, as we've seen, the gap between, say, the top grossing game and the 1,000th grossing game is really large right now. It doesn't have to be that way, right? There's no reason why we can't have more and more quality games in the App Store that are generating not billions a year, but a decent amount of money, tens of millions, hundreds of millions a year. And so I think what we're already starting to see is that free-to-play games, when free-to-play games came out, it was all about being the biggest, right? I've got a player base the size of Europe in my game. It's not going to be like that anymore. As people get better at targeting core groups of players and core demographics, you'll see a lot more million MAU, 10 million MAU games that really, really speak to their audience rather than trying to go as big as possible. And we're already starting to see that people are understanding their players and which players respond to their games best and targeting those players rather than trying to go for the broadest possible audience. And once you have that, it makes your life easier because you know your players really well. You can make new games that they love. You can cross-promote. You can really empathize with them because you're only looking at a kind of smaller part of what is a massive audience. There's 2 billion players in mobile. You can take a fairly small slice of that and still have a great player base. And so I think, to my mind, the best people making mobile games in 2020 won't worry about making them, they'll be worrying about growing their players. They'll identify with a certain group of players and they'll be trying to nurture those players with new games, with new live ops, with better content in general. I think that will be the mindset as we move towards 2020. So, to wrap it up, because I think I'm out of time, I think really the opportunity for what are called mid-tier games, so people outside the top 100, is really grown. Hopefully the numbers that I've shown you have convinced you that there's a real opportunity there to make sustainable businesses where in the past it was really boom or bust. Let's go for top 10, let's go for top 50, otherwise we're doomed. And I think this has come about by people being smarter, right? They're not just throwing money at their launches and they're hoping for the best. They are adopting smart UA strategies. They've got better reporting. They're using data to make the games better, or at least align the games more closely with the kind of players that they're bringing in through organic channels or otherwise. And the tools are there to support that. And hopefully, we're one of the tools. There's a whole bunch of other guys upstairs who are people that we work with who are also part of this ecosystem. But I think the access to these tools for small teams of 10, 20, 50 people maybe has really allowed them to get up to the level that your massive games companies with thousands of staff do. And I'll leave it there and take questions. Thank you.
We've probably got a roving mic somewhere if someone does want to ask some questions, so they've got a packed crowd. So if anyone has some questions, we can get a mic to you. You've got a couple of minutes for that. Oh, you answered everyone's questions.
Fair enough.
No takers, no anyone has any questions, they can find you out on the...
Yep, go on.
Oh, we've got a question, great.
I'm just wondering if you have observed any of the games whose lifetime of the player would actually be extending over a period of a year or beyond the standard timelines, and would the same kind of dynamics apply, or would it become a different ball game?
So sorry, the question is if games have players that last more than a year?
Yeah, I mean, typically, if you're talking about these card games, wherein users are actually investing to be able to continue to cut assets or physical assets, and actually wanting to continue to invest in the game, which could typically be beyond a year.
I mean, a lot of the games that we track have very long-lived players of multiple years. I mean, when we talk about the average lifespan, it gets really tough because, a very large fraction of the players are going to drop out instantly, and then a very tiny number of people are going to last for a year or 2 years. In terms of like raw percentage, I'm trying to think of what like the day 360 retention is, but you do see games where that is an actual number you can measure, like a percent rather than like 0.0001%. So managing people over many, many years is already a thing that many, many games do. It is a little bit genre specific, as you say. So more core games are good for that. Also, I mean, casino games are great for that. So it definitely is a strategy that people are going for, because the like you saw in those LTV curves, if you can have someone spend $5 a week for 3 years, that's actually a really good investment, as opposed to having them spend $10 on day one and then never see them again. So.